So the new DJI Mavic 3 Classic gives us the first properly labelled C1 drone. As you can see here, marked on the arm, we have a very clear UK CAA marking and the CE marking as usual, which of course is conformity rather than anything to do with this C label system, but it also has that C1 label. The big question here, the question so many viewers have been asking me over email and direct message over the last few days, is whether or not this C1 labelled DJI drone can be used here in the UK with all of the benefits associated with it. Now, although the system looks the same, regular viewers of the channel will know well that we are operating here in the UK under a mirrored version of the EU EASA regulations. This means that although the system looks the same, it is not. For instance, the same is on the pilot certification side of things. Although both the UK and the EASA call their certificates A2 or A2 CFC and GVC, and those certificates are pretty much the same, the UK version is not valid in the EU EASA member states and vice versa. The same is intended in terms of C-label drones. The UK, under the regulations, intended to implement its own system of assessment and standards bodies to verify and approve drones for use in the UK airspace subcategories. This meant that both the UK and EASA had set transition periods to allow older drones to be used in the subcategory airspace whilst the label system was developed and deployed. And then, of course, the manufacturers catch up and produce the drones which are then compliant and bear the C label. Here in the UK, as it stands, the transition period is actually due to end at the end of this year, 2022, at which point we were all intended to switch over to use the C label drones, with our existing fleets becoming legacy drones, only really used in the A3 airspace. But as we know from interviews with the CAA here on the channel, the UK system is not in place to make this happen. This includes the lack of assessment and oversight bodies. Due to this, the CAA held a public consultation and we, the drone flying public and industry, all voted overwhelmingly for an extension to the legacy and transition periods. This means that although EASA have been kicking ahead with their progress towards integrating C-label drones within their system, here in the UK we have been in something of a holding pattern, waiting for a formal response from the DFT. Its response would likely take the form of an indefinite extension to the legacy and transition periods, meaning that you'll be able to essentially carry on flying the drones you fly now in the same airspace until such time as the C-label system had been assessed and a more long-term plan set for the UK. The fact that we have two similar systems here means that we have a very unique situation. With DJI pushing ahead and creating C-label drones for the EASA zone, whilst here in the UK we are awaiting changes to legislation based on any changes that the DFT decide to make. Now we have potentially a window of time where technically, and I really do mean technically here, the C-class drones being released for the EASA region could be argued are legally usable here in the UK within that airspace, meaning that the new DJI Mavic 3 Classic can be used as a C1 drone in the UK airspace. Certainly, a consumer who is looking at the drone code and passing their flyer ID and gaining their operator ID and putting that operator ID on their drone, etc., would not likely be expected to be expert enough to differentiate any difference between the C1 EASA and UK drones, especially when the current drone code, the official guidance for hobby flyers, showing the C label system and explaining only that you need to find the C label on a drone rather than carrying out any more checks to ensure it is a UK specific approved label. This of course would not have been an issue if both systems here in the UK and the EU were developed and deployed in sync, which was certainly the original intention in terms of the original timings and legislation, because we would have C-label drones approved here and in the EU, which would have been identical, but would have passed through both sets of approval processes. Delays to the system in the EASA zone and the intended review and extension here in the UK has created something of a unique situation in terms of C-label drones. Also, when you take into account that there is something of a loophole, I suppose we could call it, in the regulations themselves here in the UK, where it could be potentially quite legitimately argued that the use of EASA-approved C-label drones is currently legal here in the UK, we end up with a bit of a confusing and complicated situation. Now, before we all get our pitchforks and decide to march on CAA HQ, it should be remembered that we are, of course, in a transitional period, and within that, we're also within a period where the regulator themselves has recommended to government a change to this very system, which was heavily supported through public consultation, meaning we need a change to both the transitional period and a review of the labelling system, all of which requires a change in law and a decent amount of work behind the scenes. This takes time, and I would fully expect there to be lots of clarification and a simplification of the current situation coming very, very soon. We have to remember that this is a unique situation, again, in terms of there being two versions of the same labelling system being implemented within adjoining airspaces. This period of confusion and void of clear guidance is very much a product of those two systems running at different speeds. Personally, I would expect that very soon, certainly before the end of the year and the existing end of the UK transition, we will see far more clear and concise guidance on this topic. Ever since DJI announced that they would be gaining an EASA C1 certification for the Mavic 3, I have been in conversation with the CAA regarding what this means in terms of the UK and using that drone in our airspace. So far, the information that we have had back is that much more guidance, etc., will be forthcoming on this topic at the end of this month, November 2022. In fact, this coincides with a planned special live stream here on Geeksvana with Mark Worry of the CAA. Mark is the General Aviation and RPAS Safety and Oversight Senior Manager and will be joining us for a special Q&A to answer all of your questions from both the hobby and commercial side of the drone industry. I am hoping that by this point we will also have clarification on this topic. Full details of the exact date and time will be following shortly, so keep an eye out on our community tab and our Twitter account for the full details. So where does this leave us in terms of using the DJI Mavic 3 Classic, a C1 labelled drone here in the UK airspace, and indeed any others which are launched by manufacturers very soon? My personal advice on this situation is that I'm expecting things to be clarified and a medium and short-term plan to be set out very soon. Certainly, with the UK transition periods coming to an end in just a few weeks, this isn't exactly some kind of crystal ball prediction here. The clarification was already required before this C1 label drone release put the cat amongst the pigeons. Personally, I would wait in terms of purchasing any C1 label drone for use within the UK airspace until such time as the DFT and therefore the CAA announcements are made later this month, as you may find things change or are at least clarified, shutting any kind of potential loophole. Although of course I have no knowledge of what is actually coming, and we could well be seeing some very positive news as well, but with that is very unstable, changing situation, so I would certainly personally recommend holding off any substantial financial outlays until we have at least the clarification, especially as this could come within just a few short weeks. It would be very easy for me to sit here and say, hey, technically flying this C1 drone here in the UK is legal and you should all go out and buy this new drone and enjoy it with the C1 benefits. I don't feel like this would be particularly responsible advice right now, as the CAA intend on providing much more guidance on this by the end of the month. And for me to advise you to do one thing and then legislation is proposed or changes made that would directly impact those choices so quickly, remember, the CAA expects more guidance on this by the end of the month, let alone anybody else actually end up in trouble. I think the best advice is really to maintain our holding pattern until the end of the month. You should remember that anyone giving you advice out there, including myself, anyone out there online, will not be stood next to you in court should anything go wrong or that technicality be tested. As drone pilots here in the UK, we're expected to take responsibility and accountability for our own actions and understand the regulations under which we are operating our drones under. Therefore, I would recommend that you take your own view on this situation, one which you are prepared to back up and justify should that end up being required. I think that I would perhaps have a slightly more hardline view on this topic if the expected wait time for clarification and answers was any longer than it actually is, and certainly I'll be looking forward to any releases from the CAA and DFT very closely. As I mentioned previously, we will also be having the live Q&A with Mark Quarry of the CAA, and I'm hoping, with all of my fingers and toes crossed, that we might have clarification on this and some other aspects of change coming within that show. Wouldn't that be nice and neat for us all? So if you're new to the channel and you want to find out more about this situation as it develops, do hit the subscribe button and activate notifications to find out more about when that information drops. Now, in terms of the existing DJI Mavic 3 models out there, which I know many of our viewers have purchased, DJI did announce that through a firmware update, these drones would also become C1 compliant across the EU. As it stands, there's no details on how the drone itself would get physically labelled. As explained by the CAA in an interview here on this channel, any labelling should be something which is at the very least tamper-proof. For instance, with the new Classic model, the label is etched onto the arm in the same way that the conformity labels are. DJI have promised more details on how they intend to physically label the retroactively updated Mavic 3 drones, but my opinion is that it's highly unlikely this would be completed to a level that will make the drone compliant here in the UK. Again, as and when this happens, I will let you know. Certainly any of the existing Mavic 3 drones out there right now within UK airspace are legacy drones flown under the transitional period. A simple firmware update will not make your existing Mavic 3 compliant. However, as promised, I will keep you all fully informed on this situation, so keep an eye on the channel as I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can with clarification on what is a unique and somewhat frustrating situation. Sean out.